There we go. And just give us a moment to start this together. First of all, David, thank you so much for joining us on this call and agreeing to do this author Q&A about your wonderful book, Waging Peace, Global Adventures of a Lifelong Activist. I hope everyone on the call has read it. It's an incredible memoir, but also an incredible testimony to the power and strength of active nonviolence. And we'll be sure to ask you lots of questions about that as we go along. For those who don't know, David Hartsough, in the course of his lifelong activism, which started when he met Dr. King in 1953, I think. 56. All right. Way before I was born. Since then, he's just been nonstop on the front lines of so many struggles for peace and justice, including founding Nonviolent Peace Force, which we'll ask him about, and also a new initiative called World Beyond War, which many of you are familiar with. That is just the tip of the iceberg of the incredible stories that David Hartsough has been up to, and I hope we get into many of them as we go along. David, let me hand it over to you for any remarks you'd like to share to set us off.
Well, thank you, Rivera. Thanks to all of you for being a part of this call tonight. I feel very lucky. I've had the opportunity to be a part of many nonviolent actions and campaigns and movements in this country and in other parts, other parts of the world. Really experimenting with the power of nonviolent action. I've written this book, Waging Peace, Global Adventures of a Lifelong Activist, which I think many of you have seen or hopefully read. And I wrote this because I wanted to share and hopefully inspire people that we can make a change, that we can help make history. We don't just need to be passive bystanders. And what we need is creative, courageous, and sustained nonviolent resistance to create change. My sense is that the sense of hopelessness is our biggest enemy. And it's crucial to keep hope alive, as Jesse Jackson has said. And I like to remember what Martin Luther King said. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And keep that in mind when we're up against really big obstacles. And I also like to think about what Martin Luther King said, perhaps some of you have heard this, in a church basement in the South. He said, "We have the power in this room, if we mobilize it, to completely change the future course of America." And he believed that. And he helped other people believe that. And together they were able to bring about major change. So that's perhaps enough for my introductory remarks. As you know, there are many, many stories in the book. And it's been just inspiring to me to get to know people in so many parts of the world that are really putting their own lives on the line and committing themselves, not just in word, but in deed, to try to help create a more just, peaceful, and environmentally sustainable world. So I'd love to hear your questions, and I'll try to respond the best I can.
Thank you so much, David. I am going to ask Grant Blakewell to cancel the screen sharing. I think that was an accidental click. And let's see, okay, we're back. Awesome. So I want to invite you guys to ask questions, and while I'm changing some of these screen options, I will just invite anyone to start. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, David.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. David, Unfortunately, I have not read your book, but I do have a question.
Okay.
I worked for a very large corporation, and one day I had a dispute with the corporation, and I was questioning the validity of their performance appraisal program, performance management program, they called it. And essentially, the only response this human resources person finally gave me was, Miles, it's not to say that you're right or you're wrong. It's just the way it is in a big corporation. And that has sat with me for quite a while. And it's made me reflect on the capitalist economic model. And Martin Luther King was bold back in the 60s to question the fundamental economic premise on which the Western world has been working for the past 250 years. And I'm wondering if you have crossed that topic in your book, Waging Peace, Economics and Peace.
I was a part of the Poor People's Campaign, which was his last campaign, where he was clearly not just challenging the racism in our society or the militarism, but our economic system, which has decided that profits and well-being of those that already have are more important than the people that are suffering and are hungry and without decent education, etc. And I think what King was calling for was a fundamental redistribution of wealth and power in our society. And I think he was challenging the whole capitalist system. I don't really go into that in depth in my book, but I think through my work with King and over 60 years of activism, I think our system, our economic system, capitalism, is really not working for the massive majority of people in this country, let alone in the rest of the world.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's made me think my own personal interaction with capitalism, and I've benefited in many ways. But at the end of the day, that response from the human resource person is exactly the way we're treated as human capital. And the word capital, it means in Latin head, so as in stock or cattle. And John Trudell, he's a First Nations Indigenous philosopher, American, passed away a few years ago. He talks about how capitalism is about not only mining resources, but they mine our being. We're treated as capital. So I just think people need to, as Martin Luther King boldly pointed out, really ask ourselves, not only to deconstruct the word and really, is that the philosophy we want to live by, or should we be looking at the democratic workplace? So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Miles. So other questions that people might have, and David, if there's any way, this might be a technological challenge, but if there's any way you can turn up the input volume on your microphone, that will help people hear you. But
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead,
Sherry. Hi, David.
Hi, Sherry.
David is having his birthday, so I'm going to tell on him on May 2nd. So happy birthday, David. I just got a text on Facebook from a 8th grade friend of mine in Afghanistan that I wanted to get your input on. It says, and in the end, bad guys will destroy the good ones and happiness will die. I am hopeless. We already are living in hell, not just we people who live in Afghanistan, but all the ones who breathe. I sent her love and solidarity, but what would you say to my friends in Afghanistan and yours and all over the world, Syria, wherever it is, particularly the youth who are feeling hopeless, as if the only response that we have is more and more violence? And I've just been reading the UN report saying the first quarter report on civilian casualties is at an all-time high, and that Kabul is the most dangerous place in the world at this moment, so, or one of the most. So I'd appreciate your response to what to tell my friends in Afghanistan and elsewhere. Thank you. I'll go mute.
Well, thank you, Sherry. That's certainly a very important question. I think the deeper answer to that question, it's really not just to me, it's to every person in the United States. And it's a plea to really put ourselves in the other people's shoes. Can we, as caring human beings, living in a country that is bombing and killing, not only in Afghanistan, but 6 other primarily Muslim countries, supposedly for some positive outcome, seemingly without any concern or care for the people that live there. And it's a little bit like the previous speaker. We're really just thinking about ourselves and our own power and privilege. And I think what is happening through the Global Days of Listening with the people, young people in Afghanistan, that's an important effort to try to help convey the hurt and the pain and the suffering and that plea to people in the United States and other parts of the world. To me, it is just so clear that not only the people in Afghanistan, but all over the world, I think 98% of the people at least want peace. But our governments continue their addiction to violence and killing, supposedly for our security, which is not working. So I think I would just say to your friends in Kabul, in Afghanistan, they have friends in the United States that are trying to change this policy. In the meantime, we want them to know that we are one human family, and we love them, and that's the reason we keep struggling as hard as we do.
Maybe, David, that's partly an answer to my next question for you.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, Sherry. Part of the question that's coming up for me is in your book, you tell of your experiences in the civil rights movement, in the work to stop the extreme violence in Central America, and traveling to Iran, the Soviet Union during the Cold War, Palestine. And you were immersed in struggles, even the ones that were successful in the end didn't seem terribly hopeful in the midst of them. And so I am wondering, what gives you hope and perseverance for doing this work personally?
Also a great question. Thank you, Rivera. I really see our whole, everyone on this planet is part of my family. And so any suffering that another human being is undergoing is a part of my family. And so it's my responsibility, as I'm a father of 2 children. If one of my children is suffering or in pain or sick, I will do what I can to try to heal them. So it's partly just that inner gut feeling for me that I have to reach out and try to do what I can to care for people that are suffering injustice, violence, war. But it's also, I deeply believe, or I know that there's people in many parts of the world who I know personally who are really struggling to try to help challenge the injustice and the violence and the war, and are really trying to work for peaceful, nonviolent solutions to the problems that they're facing. And so those people are part of my family. And I feel a commitment to them. we're working at this as a team, even though we're, thousands, tens of thousands of miles apart. So it's kind of like if you're in a relay race and you decide, oh, these other folks are running as hard as they can, but I'm tired. And it's partly what what I quoted from Martin Luther King. Realize that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it does bend toward justice. And you look at most of the horrendous things that have happened in history, they have ended. There have probably been worse things in the world than Trump. And this also will end, and a confidence that people are learning and have learned the power of nonviolence to respond to injustice and violence and war. And so I've got more trust in the people than I do in the government.
Great. Thank you, David. I want to invite people who haven't gotten a chance to ask a question to either raise your hand button, which is down on the bottom of the screen. Veronica, I see you. Or you're going to have to unmute yourself. If you are on a phone, the way to unmute yourself is *6. Likewise, that will mute you. It's kind of like a toggle switch. But let's go to Veronica. And I should mention, because I didn't mention this at the start and I forgot, that this call is being hosted by Bene Campaign Nonviolence, which Veronica is a staff member of, and I was until very recently. And a wonderful organization that's building a culture of active nonviolence in all 50 states and beyond, and has a week of actions coming up in September. I will put the link to their website in the notes on the sidebar. But Veronica, go ahead with your question.
Hello, David.
Hi,
hello. David, you who were so active in the 60s and who are still so active now, if you take a look at the world the way it was then, and you take a look at the way the world is now with all this technology and all, the world has changed a lot. I always think when I was born, we were 1 billion and we are 7 billion now. So, it's mind-blowing, just that little piece of info, right? So what would you say? Things are fast. We burn information so fast, and we kind of eat time in a different way than we ate time in the 60s. So what would you say is the most effective way of reaching people and impacting people? Because so many people don't even have the time to listen or to connect with their own deep nonviolent selves. And I truly believe the way you do, that we are all longing for nonviolence inside of ourselves. But the speed at which we live now kind of is a different dynamic maybe than it was in the 60s. So I would like you to reflect on how do we adjust to changing times and be relevant to the world as it is today. Yeah, that's my question. Is it clear? Yeah.
Is it what?
Clear.
Oh, okay. Well, it's just a very small question, though.
You think?
Well, I think, certainly there have been significant changes since the 60s. One is, technology. And in the 50s, 60s, when a cross was burned in front of somebody's home because they attempted to vote in the South, nobody knew about that use most of the time. It went unheard. Now, and with cell phones, and people can know instantly if a black man has been shot again by the police, and so we have the possibility of the truth getting out to touch people's hearts and consciences and souls. So that's a tremendous advance. I think on the positive side, I think there is so much information bombarding us from every direction that a lot of people feel overwhelmed. There's just so much terrible out there, or hopeless. It's, we're at the end of the road. And of course, there are so many terrible things out there. But a young woman that I took to Russia back in the 60s, she says, I'm a optimist because I can't afford to be a pessimist. And if we become pessimistic, we lose. The power structure wins. But I think my other response to your question is in sustained nonviolent campaigns, where people take an issue that they really care deeply about, find a group of people that feel as deeply as they do, and build a long-term campaign, as happened in the South, on the voting rights, on bus segregation, on desegregating lunch counters and swimming pools. These were not just one-time events, like the Women's March the day after the inauguration. Those 15 million people, or whatever it was, maybe it was 7 million, but it was a lot of people. If those 7 million people were to begin sustained action campaigns in their own communities, we would have something like we had in the sit-ins in the South, where people all over are saying, this is not just. We're going to act nonviolently, not just today, but tomorrow and the next day and the next month, until this injustice is corrected. And you never know when the action of one person, Rosa Parks, or the four young men that sat down at the lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, will catch on, and people all across the country can follow that. When the Iraq War started in San Francisco, we shut down the financial district for 2.5 days. And we hope that might get spread around the country. Then for 15 months, a bunch of us, once a month, were having die-ins at the federal building. Again, we were hoping that could catch on. So you never know what your action, speaking truth to power, in your own community on the issue you care about, will catch on. But during the Vietnam War, if you've read the book, when we read the names of the war dead on the Capitol steps, and then the congressman joined us, within weeks, people all across the country were reading the names of the war dead, and bringing that into the consciousness of their fellow citizens. So I think that is our challenge, I think, is to look at that long-term vision that we have, and then what is a intermediate goal that if we really struggle, and it might be months and it might be a year or more on that issue, and something that is going to be visible and just by the picture of what you're doing tells the story. In the South, the people going to register to vote and getting the response of the police and the sheriffs is to bring the police dogs and the fire hoses and beat them up. Well, I think if we can maintain our nonviolence and maintain our courage, even in the face of repression, and do whatever our action is in a sustained way, we can make a difference. We can change history.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Veronica, for that question. So, sometime I hope you'll tell some of those stories about maintaining courage literally at death's edge and the commitment to nonviolence. If you haven't read David's book, it's just full of stories like that. It's kind of like reading a war memoir without the war part from David's side.
The love part and the nonviolence part.
Right. Actually, I love those kind of stories. Let's hear from Scott Brown.
Hi, David. When I heard about this opportunity, there was a question that just jumped into my mind, and it's maybe a little generic. You may not want to answer it, but I want to ask it anyway. And that is, do you have an opinion on what the cutting edge of nonviolent activism is right now?
What is the cutting edge? Well, maybe you'll feel this is not answering your question, but I think Standing Rock has been the most significant, or one of the most significant nonviolent campaigns that's happened in this country for a while. I think it's 200 Indian tribes coming together to challenge the pipeline that was going through North Dakota. And then thousands of other ordinary people, including veterans of wars, coming to intercede with the corporation that wanted to keep digging even through the remains of cemeteries of people in the past. But I mean, for the past, or for the moment, it looks like that is not happening. But I think it's an excellent model for what ought to be happening. I think perhaps another example is around healthcare. I think there is a number of people around the country that are feeling, rather than to try to come to the rescue of Obamacare, which was a compromise at most. It really gave a lot to the insurance companies and kept the basic medical system in place. That the progressive community ought to be putting out the opportunity and the need for a single payer Medicare for all, healthcare for everyone, which would end up costing much less money, which could also benefit the Trump supporters, many of the Trump supporters who need that medical care as much as anybody. So that's another example. It's an excellent question, and I'd love to hear your thoughts if you have a feeling of what's the
That would be a great topic for a whole discussion with everyone involved. I think that's a wonderful question. Like, what is the cutting edge of nonviolence, both the looming campaigns that are brewing and also the skills and techniques that we're learning? And I think in some ways, Nonviolent Peace Force has been around for a long time, but I think its track record is growing to the point where people are starting to turn their heads around and say, wait, look what they're doing, and this kind of works. And so in many ways, I feel like the tactics of unarmed peacekeeping and nonviolent protective accompaniment that you've been pioneering with others for decades now are actually part of the body of knowledge that really gives us a very plausible response to war that is non-militarized.
I agree with that totally. When we started the Nonviolent Peace Force, we went to the United Nations and said, look, there need to be hundreds and eventually thousands of trained nonviolent peacekeepers that can go into conflict areas at the invitation of local peacemakers and human rights workers. Can the UN do this? and they said, well, we'd like to do this, but you show that it can work. And then in 10, 15 years, we'll do it. Well, happily to say, 10, 15 years later, many of the UN agencies are seeing on the ground that unarmed civilian peacekeeping protection is doing a more effective job than armed intervention. And even key people in the hierarchy of the UN are understanding that there is an alternative to armed intervention. So long term, our hope is that partly through the work of the Nonviolent Peace Force, the world can discover that there's more effective and certainly morally much superior and much less costly in terms of lives and billions of dollars in the way of trying to resolve conflict and get security for everyone.
Great, thank you for sharing about that, David. It's a personal favorite of mine, of the work that you do. Let's hear from Grant Bakewell.
Hello, David. Happy birthday. It's good to see you again, and it was good to see you at Livermore Lab on Good Friday. I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to talk longer, but that is actually the topic I wanted to pursue again a little bit with you. First, I want to apologize for not getting that book review in earlier, but I do promise I'll get it in as soon as I complete my seminary courses for ordination. But in addition to building nonviolence as a consensus in the churches, particularly the churches that are not traditional peace churches, as yours has been for centuries, as you know, I've been concerned about nuclear disarmament. And it's obvious right now with the Korean situation that, again, that's coming to a head. And I'm still wondering what the potential is for a citizens movement, an agreement between, well, Republicans and Democrats. As I understand it, George Shultz, even Henry Kissinger and others have come out for nuclear abolition. Particularly if people understood that $1 trillion is now being budgeted for more nuclear weapons, and that if that would save the taxpayers a lot of money in addition to what good it could do. What's the potential that you see for building a movement at this time?
Well, thank you, Grant, for that question. It was good to be arrested with you. A couple weeks ago on Good Friday. Well, as you know, this has been a deep concern of mine for at least 50 years, 50 to 60 years.
Yes.
I'm actually in Pennsylvania at the moment, and I've been meeting with some of the people that we walked together from Philadelphia to the United Nations back in 1958, calling on all nations to end nuclear bomb tests. And also remembering the Golden Rule, the small sailboat that attempted to sail into the nuclear testing area. And what challenged me about the Golden Rule was each of those crew members made a statement and wrote this down about why they were risking their lives to try to stop this nuclear weapons insanity. And it just touched me very, very deeply. And I thought, what could I do if these guys are willing to risk their lives to try to stop this? Well, think as you probably know, 137 nations just met at the United Nations to work on a treaty to ban all nuclear weapons, to make it illegal to possess or use or threaten the use of nuclear weapons. And the United States actually used our power to try to stop other nations from signing or joining that treaty, which is tragic. But I think it's very encouraging, both at 137 nations, not just peace people in those nations, but the governments of those nations are saying this is an absolute priority. And that we also have, as you were mentioning, a number of former secretaries of state and defense, very high level people that were actually managing our nuclear weapons development, that are saying that's really not the road to security. And so that's really hopeful. And that places like Livermore and people and like Los Alamos in New Mexico and other places that nuclear weapons are being used, that people are on an ongoing basis saying, no, we cannot remain silent in the face of threatening one another with nuclear weapons. And you mentioned Korea, but to me, it's very, very encouraging. They had a president that was not only corrupt, but was the son of one of the worst dictators that Korea, or was the daughter of one of the worst dictators in Korean history, and imprisoned people for 15 years. A good friend of mine spent 15 years in prison for being a part of the student movement at that time. Well, millions of Korean people have been in the streets the last couple of months demanding her resignation, and they were successful. And Korea is a country very much like ours, quite developed, very modern, a lot of people very comfortable. It's not that they were suffering, but they could not put up with this corrupt dictator that was also cooperating with the United States in really saying nuclear confrontation with North Korea is the only way to go. And instead, there's great likelihood that quite a progressive presidential candidate will win, who really wants to open up communication and the sunshine policy with North Korea. So if the U.S. doesn't sabotage that, I think the Korean people will have done a very important part in helping stop us from a potential nuclear war in Korea, which would not have stayed in Korea, would have become much larger.
Thank you. Thanks, David.
Could I append to that for half a second? This is Sherry. Just to say, I've just gotten a post from Ann Wright, as many of you may, that she just walked across the DMZ with a large group of women. This is the second, at least the second in the last couple of months where they've done this action. So I wholeheartedly support David's comments about nonviolent resistance.
Great, thank you, Sherry. Let's hear from Dave Warren. Thank you for your hand raise, and you'll need to unmute yourself, David. Those who are on telephone, after David's question, I'll open up your mics and see if you have any questions, just to check in with you. But go ahead, David.
Are people hearing me all right, by the way?
I think you could be a little louder, but so enunciate, speak up.
Okay.
Pretend you're at a protest. No, just kidding. Go ahead, David Warren.
Okay, thank you. Well, I just saw the notice of this conference call about 5 minutes before 8. So I haven't read your book, David. Sorry to say, actually, I'm trying to get our library to order it. But so I don't know that much about what you have done, except for what I've just heard, as well as what your book has in it. But, you know, my question has to do with nonviolent movements around the world, starting with Mahatma Gandhi and India, of course, and then in our country, I believe Martin Luther King Jr., had the greatest following in terms of numbers. And I'm just wondering, do you think the model of one person who has the stature and respect of a large number of people is needed in order to really make a change in the culture of nonviolence in this country, or do you think that it's going to be many different people in different organizations? I'm just becoming aware, honestly, of all the different nonviolent groups and people who are leading those groups. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about how we might get more of a critical mass of people involved. You did mention different groups in this country, but I don't think we've seen anything like the large numbers of people that participated in either Gandhi's India or the Martin Luther King era in this country. What are your thoughts?
Thank you, David, for that question. I certainly think it helped to have Mahatma Gandhi or a Martin Luther King helping lead the way in those movements. But I think if you haven't seen it, there's a DVD called A Force More Powerful about major nonviolent struggles over the world that have brought about very significant change, overthrowing dictators and bringing an end to apartheid in South Africa, etc. And actually, the majority of these movements have not had charismatic leaders. And I just mentioned the millions of people they've had in the streets in South Korea. As far as I know, there was no kind of central leader. It was people, the consciousness that the leader that they had was not really acting in the best interest of the people of Korea. I also just talked with one of the organizers who couldn't have been more than 25 years old, of the umbrella revolution in Hong Kong, where they had 800,000 people in the streets. There, they had a small group, I don't know, 10 to 15 students that had actually planned and organized and strategized, and they had hoped that maybe they'd get 100,000 people involved in the streets, and here they had 800,000. But you probably know the book, Why Civil Resistance Works, by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan. They studied 323 violent and nonviolent movements over the last 110 years and found that the nonviolent movements were twice as likely to be successful. And most of those did not have a charismatic leader. But I think all of them did have a core group of people that were not just, organized in a one-day protest, but were keeping their eyes on the prize, the long-term vision for significant fundamental change, and then strategizing and thinking through what are the next steps and how to appeal to large numbers of people that might join that campaign. What are their concerns? What are their needs? And also to commit themselves or to really a very clearly nonviolent discipline. That's all. I mean, little violence can really mess up a campaign, and so really making that really clear, I think, is even more important than how charismatic or beautiful the leader is.
Thank you for that, David. And I think some more recent analysis by Erica and Maria has revealed that there is a vulnerability to movements who have singular charismatic leaders, in that, as we saw clearly with the civil rights movement, if they are assassinated or imprisoned, it's a vulnerability to the movement. Yeah. And one of the findings has been that a broad organizing structure has more resilience to withstand widespread repression and roundups of leaders and organizers. So that is a good thing to reflect on.
What I would add is, in the civil rights movement, the movement was much, much larger than King. I mean, the thousands of people throughout the South starting with the sit-ins and all the way through, really even risking their lives to speak out and act. So I mean, King certainly was a wonderful support of it, but it's it's much larger than single leaders, and as you say, that can be very important in not allowing the FBI or somebody to sabotage the whole event.
I'm going to put some links for everyone into the chat box as we're getting into our last questions for this evening. In those links is a donate button if you are able and you wish to. Donations to Campaign Nonviolence Pache Bene help support programs like this and the ongoing work that they're doing all over the country. So that's an option. If you're looking for all of the books in the Book of the Month series, we do have, I believe, 4 more coming up. You can get a 15% discount by using the link that we just posted there. Also, the next book coming up in the series will be on May 25th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. Pacific Time. And it's going to be a group discussion this time, just to vary it up, on Louis Vitale's book, Love is What Matters, which, like David Hartsough's, is a memoir. It's a collection of his essays from over his years of activism. For those who don't know, Louis Vitale is the founder of Pache, one of the co-founders of Pache Bene. And the registration for that is in the Zoom chat box window. I'm going to open up the mics on our telephone guests and just give you a chance to ask any questions that you might have.
This is Wendy. David, would you speak about your war tax resistance?
Great question.
Okay. Thank you, Wendy. Since the Vietnam War, my wife, Jan, and I have found it impossible to pay half of our federal income tax for killing other people and for, developing more nuclear weapons and developing the drone programs and all this stuff. Destroying villages to save them, as they say what we did in Vietnam. So we have been refusing 50% of our federal taxes, which is what goes for wars and preparations for wars. And we send just half of what we owe each year, and we don't even make a check out to the Internal Revenue Service. We make a check out to the Department of Health and Human Services with a letter saying, please spend every penny of this for healthcare and education and well-being of people. And the other half we put into a People's Life Fund, which contributes that money to groups working for peace and social justice, environmental sanity in this country. And if and when the IRS comes after that money, the People's Life Fund refunds that money to you. It's really more like a loan or a temporary place to put the funds. And so you don't have to end up, paying it twice. But our reason for doing this is, it's hard for all of us that are, we pray and we work for peace all week long, all year long. And then, when it comes to tax time, we pay for more wars. And so if the Department of Defense came to each of our doors and said, look, we've got this new nuclear weapons development, we'd like your family to contribute $5,000 toward this. How many of us would put that money into the basket? Probably very few. But so the principle of not voluntarily cooperating with something which we feel is tremendously immoral and illegal by international law to kill innocent people is it's illegal as well as immoral, and certainly against our own consciences. So they are actually presently taking a little money out of our Social Security each month to try to get that money back. And sometimes they have just lost track of how much we owe, and they forget it. So, but a key element of nonviolence is withdrawing our cooperation from something we feel is immoral, illegal, against our conscience. And if governments cannot exist if people refuse to cooperate, and to fight wars, our governments need young people that are willing to go off and fight and kill and die, and they need the taxes, the money from the rest of us. So that's I think a very important way that we can non-cooperate. But thanks for the question, Wendy.
Thank you for that answer, David. And we are now at the top of the hour. I know that you probably have lots of more questions out there, but we're going to stop here for the evening. And if you have a burning question you have to have answered, go ahead and email it to me at rivera@riverasun.com, and I'll pester David to answer it. I want to thank you, David, for joining us and for answering all these really great questions that people have come with. I feel really grateful for everyone's participation this evening.
Could I, Rivera, and I thank you too. Could I just mention two other resources?
Yes, please do.
One is worldbeyondwar.org. And on that, among other things, you'll find a $2 trillion question. You know, would you choose to spend $1 trillion or $2 trillion for wars and preparations for wars and killing, or would you use that for creating a better life for every person on the planet? And I think that's an important question for every person to answer. A second is Olympia, FOR.org, and then /nonviolence, has a lot of phenomenal resources on nonviolence that I think, on nonviolence and on social change organizing, that I'd very highly recommend. And then my own organization, Peace Workers, peaceworkersus.org, also has a number of helpful resources that you might find helpful. So thank you to all of you for joining us tonight, especially to you, Rivera, for organizing.
My delight and pleasure. It's always a great treat to get to pick the brains of the elders who've come before, and the young upstarts as well. They have a lot to share. But I feel like we're very fortunate to be at a time when we have so many problems, but we also have so many incredible resources like yourself, David, and the many generations who are moving into actions together. This is a very powerful time to be alive on planet Earth.
Right.
So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful night, and we'll see you on some other event.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. I'm going to unmute you all, and you can all say good night. How about that?
That's right. Good night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Peace and all good.
Pace bene.
Pace bene.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.